Thank you, Alastair, for that great speech. A stirring call for a reappreciation of our politics, and also some great impressions in there as well. We're going to take some questions. If you could try and keep your questions brief to allow as many questions as possible. We'll start with you at the top there. Yeah, in the red.
Politicians have a kind of a bit of a tradition of writing diaries and memoirs, but for yourself as a non-politician, at what point did you realise that eventually you'd end up writing a quite an important book? In other words, when did you start the process of diarising your daily life?
Well, fun enough, I mentioned in that rather long and rambling and disjointed opening remarks that my dad had a very bad accident, and I mean, back to the world of technological change. If that happened today, and somebody who's young today, I was 10, the dad was in hospital. One, they'd be able to go and visit them, which I couldn't. Two, you'd be on the phone the whole time. Three, you could do Skype and all that stuff. You could do Facebook, Twitter, all that. You connected. But actually, I used to write to him every day, and my mum took these letters in, and it literally was a diary. I mean, the poor bloke, first he broke his back, he's lying bedridden, and he's done to read me dribbling on about what I had for breakfast and how well Burnley played against Sunderland. So I think that's when I started the, if you like, a process. And then when I was a journalist, I did a version of that as well. Because often, one of the most frustrating things, particularly working on a paper like The Mirror, you do a story, you go into it in real depth, and you end up writing 6 paragraphs. So actually what I used to do was kind of write about the other stuff, kind of just for myself really, and then wrap it up with all this other stuff. And then when I had my breakdown, funny enough, the realisation that I had a drink problem came when 3 days into my hospital, this psychiatrist came, and the police had taken all my possessions because I'd sort of just left them in this building, and he says, I see you keep a diary. And I said, yeah, and he says, do you record how much you drink? And I said, well, no, not exactly, but, He said, can I go through a day with you? Anyway, it was 1:20 p.m, the penny sort of dropped as I went through this day. And I think I've just always had that thing about writing things down. I mean, when you talk about, people talk about strategy, for example, I always say you haven't got a strategy until you've written it down. And I just think the written word as part of any process is so important. And then, when I started working with it, people laughed when I was at the Hutton inquiry, and I said that when I kept my diary, it wasn't intended for publication. But it wasn't. I mean, and I think if you read it, it's like when Jonathan Powell, Tony's chief of staff, first read it, he said, well, nobody can say, nobody's going to accuse you of this being self-serving because you come over as a complete lunatic. So it was very much written for me at the time, like an emotional dumping ground. But then I think there were times when I realised I was writing about history. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, for example, is the only time I've ever written minute by minute. Now, I wasn't thinking, this is great, or this is going to be great when I do a book. Because I didn't know it was going to be such a big thing. And I must have sensed something. And I literally, if you read that bit, it's like, 4:45 a.m, McGuinness came in, said such and such, 6:12, Trimble on the warpath again, whatever it might be. And I must have had that sense of recording something.
I'd like to thank you for speaking about mental health issues, because I think you've made a real contribution to that. And the second point really is linked to that. I'd like to know really why the Labour governments, the early Labour governments after Thatcher and Major, decided to support the Thatcher policy of privatising so many public services and making many, many companies extremely rich at the expense of taxpayers. And just linked to the mental health issue, it's just nice to know what you feel about mental health services today, because they too have taken the toll of, in many cases, being privatised. And sadly, as a committed Labour supporter and a local authority worker, during all of that time, we were destroyed by Labour's support of Tory policies of privatising public services. And it's continuing today, and I can see no hope for Labour ever supporting publicly owned public services again.
Okay. If this was question time, that'd be a wild round of applause. See, I don't. We're not going to agree on the language here, because I think that what I thought you were going to say right at the start was, why did you commit to certain central tenets of Tory government economic policies, such as we're going to stick to their spending limit for 2 years, we weren't going to raise the top rate and basic rate of income tax, although Ed has committed to raising the top rate again. Now, what that meant, I think, is that I think Tony took a judgment pretty early on that, in terms of public services, that the public, and as I said, we're in a democracy, and you do have to kind of, the public ultimately are the boss. The public were not, at that time, going to allow a government to put the kind of money into public services that was going to come through general taxation already. And so, for example, we wanted to build new hospitals. If we were going to build those new hospitals, we were going to have to do it in some sort of partnership with the private sector. And you can say, well, the PFI contract was this, it was that, it should have been this, it should have been that, but that's the decisions that were taken. And likewise, what you call privatisation, I think the current government would probably call marketisation, or however you want to call it. I think that some of these services, it was felt that the only way that we're going to be able to deliver them in the scale and quantity that we think they should be delivered is if we have that some sort of partnership there. So that's the thinking behind it. And I think if you look at, and I do think actually we did deliver improvements across the public services. I think in relation to mental health, my worry on that is less your concern. It's the fact that with the whole kind of austerity agenda, that when it comes to arguing for spending on health, mental health always goes to the bottom of the queue. And there's a reason for that. It's one of the reasons I campaign on it. Is that, and to be fair, Nick Clegg's been out on this, and so's Andy Burnham, and I think there's a kind of momentum developing. I wish Cameron would say something about it. I wish that Jeremy Hunt would, but there is a momentum. But if you're a commissioner and you're in charge of the purse strings of a local health service, and you've got cancer here, kids services here, and mental health here, which are you going to cut? And I'm afraid they're all going down the mental health route. Because children, oh my God, can you imagine the fuss with that? Oh, cancer, oh no, they're really powerful, they're really strong. And that is why ultimately, back to campaigning and gay rights and hard milk and racial equality and the rest of it, we have to campaign on these things in part so that the policymakers don't think they can get away with easy choices.
Question, yeah.
Okay, you said some very sensible things, I thought, about education, about tailoring education to individual needs. I'm wondering where that kind of vision was in the New Labour government. What I saw from New Labour was focus more on exams, make sure everyone's kind of always kind of being tested, graded, everything, and then go with these, creating more and more universities for everyone to go to. Just wondering where.
Well, when you get the 4 volumes tonight, you'll find, I think the one area, I was and am very, very loyal. Tony, the government, defendant. But I think if there was one policy area where I never felt totally comfortable on the same page, it probably was education. I'm quite old school on education in this, to some extent. I really do believe this country's only going to make it if we all commit to using local schools in which we all have a say, we all have a stake. But I think then within them, there should be much greater freedom and flexibility. Now, I think we were slightly, I thought David Blunkett was terrific in lots of ways, I really do. And the focus on standards rather than structures, I thought that was absolutely right. And again, earlier in my comments, I criticised one of the moves we made on dropping the idea that everybody should learn a foreign language. Now, actually, slightly inconsistent with what I said in terms of, you find out what they're good at and you develop on that. But I agree with the premise of your question, and I think what I'm saying, what I'm suggesting, is actually a very different approach to what this government's doing, We did. There are countries though now, and I think they're the developing countries that are starting to do this, and I do think it's the future. So I accept the criticism of the question, but it makes me believe more strongly what I said in my.
You talked about the public disenfranchisement with politics. Do you think that PR, which was through your field, can provide a solution or a partial solution to the declining trust of politics and politicians?
Right, I'll take that in a moment. What did you want to
Where do you stand on, can we afford our nuclear deterrent still? Should we still have it? And secondly, quickly, where do you stand on the Scottish referendum?
Okay. Right, nuclear deterrent, yes. Scottish independence, no. I'll come back. Is that okay?
Nice maneuver, nice maneuver.
Well, see, I don't kind of buy this notion. I don't really know what PR means anymore. Because let's say, right, so he stands up and he says you can tweet, okay? So let's say some of you have been sitting tweeting, right? And you might have tweeted what I've said. You might have tweeted something I've said followed by what a jerk. God, this guy talks a load of crap, whatever. Now, that is being read by some members of the public. Is that public relations? Is it communication? Is it media? What is it? It's just part of a never-ending conversation that's become much more complicated than it used to be. I think that the changed media landscape has made things both more complicated but also simpler. More complicated in that you can't control the message anymore. Simpler in that means that you should only focus on what you can control, is what you say and what you do. So when you say re-engaging the public, the best thing that can re-engage the public is, and if I look at one example, the only example I can see out there that I think sort of does this is Angela Merkel. Treat people seriously, say what you can do, say what you can't do. I think with all of us, we were as guilty as this as anybody, is politics as you're the lead, we're the leaders, we can sort it all out. It's just not true. It never was, but it's certainly not true now. So actually, something as complicated as a global financial crisis and its implications, you know, this is really difficult. And here's my best guess of what I think we should do at this time. Here's my hope as to how it might sort of then pan out, but there could be unintended consequences. That's a much more kind of honest framework for communications. Now, the difficulty with that in our politics, which is founded on this idea that the government stands there, the opposition stands there, and you go like that, right, is that the slightest admission of don't know, can't be sure, is like, you know, you're in, back. So until the sort of framework, both for the political debate and the media debate changes, very, very, very difficult for politicians. And I think the public should be more understanding of that. And if the public more understanding of that, then the politicians will start to frame the response differently. And Angela Merkel is a really good example of this, because she does operate like that, and the German people appreciate that. It's a much more mature dialogue. Any Germans here? Your mother. Independence, totally opposed, because I feel, I mean, I was born in Yorkshire, but I feel more Scottish than English, and I feel more British than both. And I think that the Scots, I mean, here's another, you talk about the nuclear deterrent. Power in the world is really, really important. China developing power, that's going to have impact on all of us. America being the only existing superpower, that's really, really important. Nuclear deterrent, you can argue whether there's a strategic defence need, but there's certainly kind of sense of that being part of the power of the country. Being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council is a really, really important thing. Here's an unintended consequence. If Scotland goes independent, and I was Angela Merkel, or I was the Prime Minister of Japan, or was, you know, one of the Brazil, or one of the Turkey, or, I'd say, excuse me, you weren't very big in the first place, and now you've just got a lot smaller. And what's more, you're not as powerful as you used to be, because you used to have that empire, Commonwealth thing all around the world. That's gone as well. So thanks very much, but can you, Americans and Chinese, Could we get together and could we maybe think the Brits, time for them to go? That'll happen. No, I don't want that. Could he have a question?
Yeah, a question from a lady. Yeah, there. Great.
We call them women in our schools.
Talking about how people can make political change happen, do you think protest and campaigning is as effective or maybe more effective than voting is in generating political change today?
No. And I watched that Russell Brand. How many people saw that Russell Brand interview? Absolutely amazing. How many saw it live? Handful, right? That's back to how the media works. Right, I was on Newsnight the other night, quite a dull discussion. How many saw it live? 2 people, I don't waste the bloody time. Mismatch of the day, nobody watched it. But the reason the Russell Brand thing connected was because it was kind of electric TV and word spread like wildfire on the social networks. And I thought actually it was an amazing performance, but the bit I really didn't like was when he said there's absolutely no point voting. And then when Paxman said, well, what's the alternative? He didn't have one. And I think, I actually think we should have brought in compulsory voting for local and national elections. I think to force people to say, you have a responsibility here. It's not moaning about everything, actually take some responsibility, at least up to the point of finding out who the candidates are, roughly what they stand for, and deciding which of those you think is best. I mean, when you see people, when you see newspapers, competition like Celebrity Big Brother and X Factor, why you should vote for him against her, and why it really matters, and 10 reasons for this, and 10 reasons for that, and you get to something like a general election, and it's like, why bother? I mean, it just makes you want to scream. So I think we should always encourage people to vote, and if the culture develops that voting is not important, politicians have to take a lead and say, I'm sorry, but it is important, and what's more, we're going to make it important by finding you if you don't.
You say you'd like to get rid of private schools to move towards.
I didn't quite say that.
But to move towards more meritocratic approach to education. Would you support the reintroduction of grammars?
No. Because I'm opposed to selection in schools as well. And partly because of what schools are. Schools, back to the question we got up there, schools aren't just, yes, exams are very important. You see, I've got 3 kids, all right, we live in a nice house and I've always had a good job and all that stuff, and so they've probably got opportunities that other kids don't necessarily have. But I think my kids get a better education for having been in classrooms with kids who come from Kosovo during the war, or with Syrian kids who are coming now. I think that is part of education. I think my kids are more streetwise than and what's more, my boys probably have more luck with ladies because they don't call them ladies, that kind of thing.
Keep on going. One question.
Just to link into what you were saying, so how do you get to that point?
Well, it's very, very hard. How many people heard my Missus on the Stay programme yesterday? Bloody hell, nobody!
Would you repeat that?
No, the question. Why has it never really been taken on?
Your question.
Your question.
Oh, I said, did anybody hear my Missus on the Stay programme yesterday?
Your missus.
My Missus, my bird.
Let's
just saying, you have to
let's
come
have a
in for a
straw
little
poll.
chat.
People, put your hand up if you prefer lady or missus. So hands up for lady. Hand up for missus. Okay, people seem to prefer missus. Okay.
I won.
You lost.
Okay. No, I think she was asked about, why has the left never taken this issue on, and she made this point that it's this, you have to make calculations about how much effort you can put into something that's going to be required for the change that you might get. The chances are, for example, her brother is a human rights lawyer, and he actually says that under the Human Rights Act it's probably impossible anyway. If somebody wants to have a private school, they can have a private school. If somebody doesn't want to go to, But there are some countries, I think Canada and I think maybe Finland, I think actually you can't, as it were, sell education as a commodity. And, but I think it's just one of those things that's so ingrained, so entrenched, you'd be taking on the entirety of the establishment, and governments, you know, and also, I'll be absolutely honest, I used to mention it every now and then to Tony Blair, and he'd say, are you mad? You know, you sort of hear your voices again. It was just too, it's in the box marked, too difficult for the change that you would actually make.
Why the tax benefits?
I totally agree. Giving them charitable status is absurd. I agree, yeah.
We're going, because of time, we're going to take 3 questions, and then to man in the red, the back, and
Were any women amongst them? Anybody who's not white?
it's always known for its diversity.
Okay, well maybe you should work on that. Challenge it. Red. Okay.
And yeah,
I'll take them all together, yeah.
Seb.
Alright, just going back to what you said about education before and your kind of idea of the meritocracy, you seem to me to take kind of Ken Robinson line, we should improve particular things in people, and to me that suggests we have to cut other things as well. But as I see it, there's a reason why academia is getting a lot more interdisciplinary at the moment, and that's because actually it doesn't work like that. I didn't do history, but if I hadn't done history at all, I wouldn't have the confidence now, as I do English, to do any historical research.
Yeah.
And I think you're talking about real life subjects as a game, like sport, but they're not games and we don't really know the rules. So I'd like your opinion on that.
Okay.
You said that education was not a commodity. I've tried both French and English system, and having been to a private school, I've met several people who were my friends, not only white and maids, in state schools, and when they told me that their French teachers were saying fromage instead of fromage, and said Spanish teachers saying gracias instead of gracias, and who after sixth form couldn't even speak a word of proper French or proper English. I'm just wondering, yes, it's not a commodity, but how do you receive a good education then?
I think you receive a good education by a government understanding that the entirety of the population sees this as being really, really important for everybody and not just for themselves. And I think what the private system does, it gives people the opportunity to say, well, actually it doesn't so much matter about those schools because these people, the schools that we use, the schools that our kids, we went to and our kids are going to, they're fine. And everything will trickle down and it will be okay. And I'm afraid that's how I think Britain has worked for a long, long time. Let me just tell you something about this as well, because the other great myth that is perpetrated is that all these schools, private schools, are really good schools. Now, I've got to tell you, if you spend 15 grand a term or whatever it is at Eton, you'd expect to get quite a lot for that, and they have amazing facilities and all the rest of it. And I'm not saying, here's an amazing historical fact for you. Eton has produced more prime ministers than the Labour Party. That is great, right? But it's true. Cameron has just taken it into that league. Even though he didn't go there, he went to Peckham Comprehensive, I think he said. So, no, that's a joke. Okay, but just on your point, this thing about, my kids' primary school, Gospel Oak Primary School, we had a head teacher with a really bad offset report. And the head teacher eventually went and he got payoff. Do you know what he did with his payoff? Bought a private school. And he's now one of the many, many people in Hampstead teaching kids privately, and all the Jemimas and the Samantha's and the rest of it. So what you were framing your question as if to say you're only going to get a bad education in the state school. Okay, you get a good education if you have good teachers. You get good teachers if you train them well, you pay them properly, and the whole country sees that as a priority. But we still don't. Today's selection, I think, is very, very hard to call. Really hard to call. Obviously, I hope Labour win. I think it's hard to see where David Cameron's going to get votes he didn't get last time. If they can persuade people that this economic recovery is real, then they could win. I think it's difficult because at the moment it doesn't feel real to many people. It feels real to people in the banks who are back doing what they did when they were causing the disaster. It feels real to people who are looking at stats, figures, but that's because we went through such a crash that now it'd be amazing if we weren't bouncing back a little bit. But I don't think it feels real to a lot of people. Ed, I think, is doing better than people give him credit for, and I think he's starting to make the weather. He made it over energy, he made it over Murdoch. I think he's starting to do it over housing, which is one of those issues that should be centre stage and isn't. But there's still a lot of resistance out there to Labour. Normally, our kind of pendulum system is they give you a go, and then they give you another go to think you're okay. And we were given a third go, which is very, very rare for any government, and then we get kicked out. And normally, the public say, right, well, you're going to have a long time in the wilderness, then you come back. That's how it works. But actually, the fact that Cameron didn't win a majority means the rules are sort of changed. I think we could come back. If I had to put my life on it, I'd say probably a Liberal coalition.
You heard it here first.
So, no, I said it last week at the university. Because we had a lady chairing it and I was more expansive. Now, I've got to be in a Marriott hotel in half an hour. There was one question I didn't answer, but I forgot what it was. Oh, it's up there.
I was asking you about your meritocracy.
I think we both got a point. How we, you see, you're absolutely right to say, I'm looking at this for sport. That's how sport looks at things. But I think there's an awful lot we can learn about that. I think we still treat sport as almost like a kind of bit of a luxury. But I think the fact that the real top elite performers, often we see them in sport, I just think sometimes we should look at how they do that and think, why can't we apply that to the economy? Why can't we apply that to development of business potential and so forth? So you're right. Yes, I wouldn't want my kids not to do history, not to do English, not to do a bit of science. But I'd really like it if actually you could spot real talent, real potential early on and say, you know what, we're going to work on that.
Can I follow that up?
Yeah.
No, because I've got to go do the
Afterwards, now we have a book signing. Alastair has managed to mention his books a few times.
Twice.
Okay, so
Because I was asked.
okay. That's one way of spinning it. First, thank you, Alastair, for talking and for your fantastic answers, and for leaving us with a really uplifting and empowering message that cynicism about politics is very easy, but actually we all have a responsibility to engage in the political process. So thank you very much, Alastair.